Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. In the last interview that I did with Dr. Speak, hey, Dr. Speak.
Good to see you.
And he said I can call him Dan.
Absolutely.
In the last interview, we talked about the logical problem, okay? And we're going over this book that Dr. Speak has written, and it's called The Problem of Evil. Highly, highly encourage you to get this book. It's very good. So at the end of that interview, we saw, okay, it looks like Plantinga has given us a pretty good guide on how to respond to the logical problem of evil. There can be tweaks along the way to Plantinga's response, but overall, it looks like the logical problem of evil is not going to be successful in what it aims to show. But there's a different version of the problem of evil, and that's called the evidential version, and that's what we're going to focus on in this interview. So good to have you back, Dan.
Good to be back.
Okay, so let's start by talking about William Rowe. Mm-hmm. He's the main guy that introduced the evidential problem of evil, and to get us acclimated here, he starts out with these two cases of evil. So why don't you lay these out? These two.
Yeah, cases. Good. And maybe I'll say this before that, Jordan. I mean, William Rowe is one of the atheist philosophers that I think everybody should know and love. And he is extremely careful. He's extremely sensitive to religious experience. So a lot of folks who are arguing for atheism are often kind of dead to religious life and dead to religious motivations. Bill Rowe was not like that at all. He was very alive to it. He was a theist, an atheist who himself was kind of disappointed that he couldn't be a theist. That friends of his in the Purdue philosophy department said that he would often be singing hymns around the department and sort of wishing that he could sing them to God, but he couldn't. And his reasoning and his arguments always show great regard and great respect for theist and Christian thinkers. And we have tons to learn from him. So it's sort of my pleasure to be thinking about this argument of his, this evidential argument. If you think about the one we talked about before, if you think about the logical problem, there's like some metaphysics, and there's a certain kind of bloodlessness to it. With the evidential problem of evil, Rowe is not going to let us off the hook in any bloodlessness. He's going to attend to some of the harsher realities about evil. And in a pretty deep way, I find this argument much more compelling. I mean, we saw that there's a certain kind of, almost, sometimes it feels to me, a kind of easy way of dismissing on purely logical grounds the logical problem. Here, this gets stuck in our craw, and you're right to start with these two cases. So Rowe gets motivated by thinking about the evidential problem, in part because he himself thinks he sees that the logical problem is not going to succeed. And he says, but look, there's a more probative argument, an argument that's much harder to dismiss, that's the conclusion of which is not that it's impossible that God exists, but rather that it's unlikely that God exists. And now the way to think about evil is not as something that's inconsistent with the existence of God, but that probabilifies the non-existence of God, that makes it unlikely that God exists. And yes, two cases that Rowe sort of famously focused on. His very first one is the case of a deer that's trapped in a forest fire. The forest fire starts accidentally, a lightning strike, and the young deer is caught in this fire and trapped and can't escape. And eventually, the fire consumes the deer, and the deer dies on the floor of the forest. But importantly, the deer doesn't die immediately, but lays there suffering in agony for some days before it finally succumbs to its injuries. And that's called that one E1. It's commonly called E1, but first evil. Okay. And then the second one is this one's a real world case, right? E2. It's the story that Rowe saw in a newspaper in 1986 of a young girl in Flint, Michigan, who she was 5 years old, and her mother left her in the care of her boyfriend, and she went out, and the boyfriend, beat, raped, and murdered the young 5-year-old girl, right? And that case, sometimes called Sue, is what we'll call E2. And so what Rowe tries to do is take these quite gritty, realistic, In the one case, it's an actual real world case. In the Sue case, in the Fawn case, it's a case that he says everyone should believe happens all of the time. Things like that happen all the time. So it's not like it's not obscure. Just fill in the details, and we know that things like that happen in the world. And then he wants to leverage these into a powerful argument that probably God doesn't exist.
All right. So what is Rowe's argument?
Yeah, good. So here's the basic idea. Again, turning to my highly sophisticated technology here. Sure, all the fans at home are thrilled by the detail here. Okay, so here's the argument. So crucial to see in order to start understand this argument is the idea of what Rowe calls a gratuitous evil. And the reason he brings up E1 and E2 is because he thinks they have a plausible claim on being gratuitous, which we can say a little bit more about shortly. What would it mean for an evil to be gratuitous? It would be this, that it's an evil that not even God could have a justified reason for allowing. Or here's another way to put it. An evil is gratuitous if its occurrence cannot be justified on the basis of ways it makes the world better or avoids the world being worse, right? So, and the way Rowe initially put it was that it's instances of intense suffering that don't contribute to a greater good or eliminate a worse evil. And so he thinks then here's the claim. Once you understand what a gratuitous evil is, he thinks the first thing you should accept, this is sometimes called the theological premise, is that if God exists, then there would be no gratuitous evils. And that's a pretty plausible claim. Now, notice it's not the claim that if God exists, there'd be no evils at all. Maybe there'll be lots of evils, but they won't be gratuitous. So if you think about evils like how sore you are after working out, or even burning your hand in a fire, those aren't going to be gratuitous because there are ways to explain, well, could there be a good reason for allowing those? Might they contribute to a greater good or to the lessening of a worse evil? And intuitively, yes, right? We don't have any trouble with those. So plausibly, he thinks, if God exists, there would be no gratuitous evils. There might be some evils, but no gratuitous ones. And it's worth noting that probably most people who've thought about Rowe's argument have been inclined to accept the first premise. Like no controversies there are, but most people have thought I'm accepting the first premise, right? The theological premise. But the second premise is that there really are gratuitous evils. That's what E1 and E2 are going to be doing, right? And then the conclusion from that, I have it here as, so God doesn't exist. If we were being really careful, we'd say probably God doesn't exist. And this is why this argument is often called the inductive argument from evil, or the evidential argument from evil, because the evil is supposed to be taken as inductive evidence that God doesn't exist, not that, it's not a logically necessary requirement that God doesn't exist. It only gets us to probably, and maybe we need to unpack why that is.
All right. Now, what we want to do is talk first about Rowe's justification for each premise.
Yeah.
And then ways that people have objected to that justification. So start with the empirical premise, which is actually premise 2, because a moment ago you mentioned a lot of people are inclined to accept 1. So that's why we're going ahead and looking at 2 first. So say we accept 1. What about 2? What is Rowe's justification for that premise?
Good. And this is where E1 and E2 come in. Okay. So what would it mean for an evil to be gratuitous? Well, it would be an instance of intense suffering that doesn't contribute to a greater good or to the avoidance of a worse evil. Okay. Then what he does is he invokes E1 and E2, right? And he asks you to consider the fawn's circumstance. And he asks you to consider Sue's, the young girl's, circumstance. And he invites you to try to come up with a reason that could justify God in allowing those. Right? And now notice something. Rowe has carefully chosen these cases. So if your listeners have any familiarity with standard efforts at theodicy, You'll be thinking about things like freedom of the will, or you'll be thinking about things like soul making, like whether or not allowing evils contributes to a creature's moral development, or maybe you'll be thinking about things like the relevance of natural laws or something like that. And notice that Rowe has carefully chosen E1 and E2 so that it's hard to see how, for example, free will could be relevant. After all, the fawn it doesn't have free will, and its suffering doesn't have anything to do with free will, right? It's not so obvious what soul could be made. The deer's soul, what's going on? That doesn't seem like that's relevant, right? Furthermore, the same thing with the Sue case, right? Maybe you think somebody's free will, like the dude's free will who did the horrible thing, but it's very tempting to say, but how could that guy's free will be so valuable as to allow this horrible thing? Whose soul is getting made? The young girl's? No, she ends up dying. And again, so he's carefully chosen these so that when you go searching around for a reason that would justify an omnipotent and omnibenevolent being and allowing them, you essentially come up empty, right? Now, it's open to your viewers to try to come up with accounts of what it is that would justify God in allowing E1 and E2. But I myself am inclined to agree with Rowe, and most people have, that we do largely come up empty. We don't really come up with satisfying answers. And now here's the crucial thought. This is why this argument is inductive, is that Rowe urges on us a certain kind of inductive inference from the fact that we can't come up with any good reasons that God would have for allowing E1 and E2. Two, there probably aren't any good reasons for allowing E2. From the fact that we can't figure it out to there probably is nothing. And then that's why he thinks you conclude those are gratuitous. What is it for them to be gratuitous? It's for there to be no good reason for a omnipotent, omnibenevolent being to allow them. Should you think E1 and E2 are such as that? He thinks yes, because of this neat little inductive inference. You can't come up with a good reason. You can't see any reason that God could have for allowing it. Two, therefore, probably there is no good reason. That is, probably they're gratuitous. And that's why this is probably down here, is because at premise 2, the conclusion really is there probably are gratuitous evils, right? Mm-hmm. E1 and E2 are just probably gratuitous.
Okay, and that's called a no-seum inference.
It's kind of fun, right?
The idea is I don't see any reason that God could have for allowing that evil.
Yes.
And so there probably isn't a reason.
Good.
Okay. Did you want to add anything?
That was fun. So Stephen Weikstra, a longtime philosopher at Calvin College, gave us that terminology of no-seum. Apparently, there are these little bugs that in the Midwest, some of your viewers might know about this, that they're so small that you don't see them, but they bite you, and then you know they're there. And so Weikstra said this inference is a no-seum inference. So from the fact that you don't see them, that is, you don't see the reasons that God could have for allowing them, you infer they're probably not there. So yes, this is a no-seum inference. Yeah.
A no-seum inference that justifies premise 2.
Premise 2.
Rowe.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Now, in the book, you sketch out 2 ways that you can object to that justification that Rowe gives for premise 2.
Yeah.
So go ahead and walk us through those 2 objections.
Well, good. Well, one way is to think about that no-seum inference. So what a number of contemporary theistic philosophers have tried to do is develop what's called skeptical theistic responses. And skeptical theists are folks who take issue with the second premise by taking issue with that no-seum inference. So by taking issue with the inference from we can't see what God's good reasons are for allowing E1 and E2 to therefore probably there is no good reason for God to allowing it. And the skeptical theist says, well, look, that might not be a great inference. Why think it might not be? Well, so not all no-seum inferences are bad no-seum inferences, right? There are good no-seum inferences. So if you go to I yell out to Jordan, hey, Jordan, get me a beer out of the fridge. And Jordan goes and looks in the fridge and he reports back, there are no beer in the fridge. And I say, well, why do you think that? And he says, I didn't see any. That's a pretty good no-seum inference. If Jordan looks in the fridge and he doesn't see any beer, and he comes to the conclusion that there's no beer in the fridge, we think that's fine, right? Similarly, right now we could look around my office. There's no motorcycles in my office. I don't see any motorcycles in my office. Probably there are no motorcycles in my office from the fact that I don't see them. Okay, that's a good no-see inference. But here are some bad ones, right? I look into the night sky and I don't see any space aliens, and so I conclude probably there are no space aliens. That's not a very good no-see inference. Here's another bad one. I'm a mediocre chess player. I watch the awesome expert chess player, the grandmaster chess player. I watch him make a move in which he sacrifices his queen, right? I can't make any sense, heads or tails, about why he's sacrificing his queen. Should I infer from that there's probably no good reason? No, I shouldn't infer that. It's bad no-see inference. What's going on in these cases? Well, what the skeptical theist has said is this: in cases where there's a good no-see inference, it's because it's reasonable for you to think that you have what it takes, such that if the thing were present, you'd probably be perceiving it, right? So in the beer case, why is Jordan's inference about the beer a good no-see inference? Well, because if there were beer in the fridge, we have every reason to think that Jordan's got what it takes to recognize beer in the fridge. Similarly, if there were a motorcycle in my office, we think I've got everything it takes to recognize it. But then you turn to the night sky. Do I have what it takes such that if there were space aliens, I'd probably see them? No. Do I have what it takes such that if the chess master really did have good reasons for sacrificing his queen, I'd probably recognize them? No, I'm too much of an idiot. So bad no-see inferences are cases where we reasonably think you don't have what it takes, such that if the thing you're looking for was there, you'd recognize it. And now what the skeptical theist says, and you can see it coming, is the Rowe inference is a bad no-see inference, because it's an inference from, I can't see what God's good reasons would be for allowing this thing, to there probably is no good reason, when my access to the scope of God's reasons, you might think, is severely limited by the kind of thing I am vis-a-vis God. And so what the skeptical theist has said is, one reason to resist this argument is by at least notice the skeptical theist is not saying that the second premise is false. The skeptical theist is saying, I don't think Rowe's argument for that is compelling. I think I can resist that and be within my rights as a theist. That is, I can be within my rights as a theist to look at the no-see inference he urges and say, I think that's a bad inference, so I'm not going there. That's all the skeptical theist is claiming.
Yeah, and that's important. The skeptical theist is not saying premise 2 is false.
Right.
The skeptical theist is saying we should withhold judgment on premise 2. We don't know whether premise 2 is true or whether it's false, simply in virtue of the kind of creatures we are. We can't make this no-see inference.
That's right. That's the idea. Right. Good.
So that's one response, basically saying let's withhold judgment about premise 2. But a second response tries to say, no, premise 2 is false.
Yeah.
So how does this response work?
And that one, when in the famous paper that when this argument first got initiated by William Rowe, Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, in which he introduced the notion of the distinction between being friendly atheists and unfriendly atheists. And look, that's one of the reasons I start by saying what I said about Rowe, is that he was an extremely friendly atheist. What distinguishes a friendly atheist from an unfriendly one, he says, is this: that the friendly atheist thinks there are rational theists. I'm not claiming that they're irrational. There are reasons that someone could have for being a theist. I just don't accept them, but I don't think they're idiots, right? So I'm friendly in the sense that we accept the rationality of one another. Notice, I think there should be a parallel notion for friendly theists versus unfriendly theists. And I've been seeing a lot of things kicking around on the internet since I've been paying attention. I just went on Twitter recently, where there's a lot of unfriendly theists. That is, theists who think that atheism is transparently irrational. That's a bad view. I mean, there's no way anybody who knows, knew William Rowe carefully, or knows Paul Draper or what have you, like, these are not irrational people who are resisting the good with, we should have the same attitude of friendly theism towards these folks as William Rowe has towards me as a friendly atheist. So parenthesis on that. When in that paper, when he introduces this, he says, well, one thing the theist could say in response to my argument, and he actually thinks this is a sensible view, this is why he gets to his friendly atheism, is he suggests what he calls the Morean shift. Okay, and we can decide how far we want to go into this, but here was the basic idea, is that he saw that someone could argue this way, right? Accept this first premise, accept the second premise, and therefore get the third premise. Or he thought, look, somebody could argue this way too. Keep the first premise. If God exists, then there are no gratuitous evils. And then if those people thought they had a really, really awesome argument or set of arguments to think God exists, right? So instead of the second premise, here they think God exists. Then the thing to conclude, if you think if God exists and there are no gratuitous evils, and you think God exists, the thing to conclude now is, so there are no gratuitous evils. So he thinks that that's a reasonable way to go. If you think you have really good evidence that God exists, then even if you accept the first premise, the thing to conclude is, well, E1 and E2 are not gratuitous evils, right?
Yeah.
It won't be from looking at the gratuitous evils and thinking you see a reason why God has for permitting them. That you probably don't get to see. But if you think your reason for thinking God exists is independently of these concerns about evil, really strong, then you can reach the conclusion that there are no gratuitous evils that way.
Yeah. And what we should notice as you laid that out is the how nicely that illustrates this saying that one man's modus tollens is another man's modus
Exactly.
ponens.
That's
so
right. That's
what's going on there in that Morean shift is to say, well, let's hold up kind of side by side these two arguments.
That's right.
And you've got the argument on the board on the one hand, and then you got this other argument where the second premise is replaced with God exists.
Exactly.
Okay, so now you compare these two arguments and you say, which premise is more plausible to me? The one where it's gratuitous evils exist, or the one where God exists?
That's right.
And what's interesting is the theist might say, well, I've got some really good arguments for God's existence. And so that leads that theist to think, so there are no gratuitous evils.
That's right.
But there's another way that the theist could think about that, and that is the theist could be a reformed epistemologist and say, well, I don't have a good argument for God's existence, but gosh, it just, it seems to me so obvious that God exists. I just find myself having this belief that God exists that I just can't, shake. So for that theist, it's not that they have this great argument for God's existence, but nonetheless, when comparing these two in that Morean sense, that one where God exists, the premise there is just going to look really obvious to them. And so that theist may say, and that gives me a reason to think that there are no gratuitous evils.
Yeah. Nicely done, Jordan. I mean, obviously I do bring that out in the book, and I have certain kinds of sympathies with certain forms of reformed epistemology, with at least certain parts of the planning a strategy on these things that not everyone has. And I think it's a little harder to show how that goes, but I think it does go through that since if that picture is right, a person can be warranted in their belief in God even without evidence, right? Given that their faculties are functioning properly in the right mini environment, etc., all of that, and then they can be warranted in their belief in God's existence, and then it will function in the same way. Then the second premise will be that God exists, and that they'll have sufficient warrant for it, even if it's not evidential, and it will lead to the conclusion that probably there are no gratuitous evils. Yeah.
Okay, so now, actually, to be fair, in the book, you offer some criticisms of that reformed epistemology type view. And so if viewers want to go into that,
That's
they
right.
can do that, but we need to keep moving here. So,
Sure.
all right, you laid out how the skeptical theist responds, basically by saying, hey, that justification you gave for premise 2, that's not a good justification because it relies on this case of a bad no-seem inference. There are good no-seem inferences, but this one seems like a bad one. And so there's not a good justification for premise 2, so we should just withhold judgment. But then this Morean shift says, no, we can say premise 2 is actually false, and we can do it by holding up, these two arguments and saying, this one seems more obvious to me. Okay, now let's shift then, unless you want to say anything more about premise 2, let's shift to premise 1, because there's some criticisms of that.
Yeah. Well, so it turns out that I'm probably one of these theists who's tempted to resist the first premise now too. But I don't want to deny it's got a lot of intuitive theological plausibility, right? There's a lot going for it. I'm tempted to follow in the footsteps of Peter Van Inwagen, who does raise some worries about the second premise, why he resists it. And in light of I mentioned before that I'm inclined towards open theism. That is, I'm inclined towards the view that in God's giving us robust libertarian free will, that leaves the future genuinely metaphysically open in such a way that not even an omnipotent and omniscient being knows what free beings will do with their free choices when they make genuinely free choices. If there are any indeterminacies at all in the universe, then not even an omniscient being knows how those indeterminacies are going to resolve, whether they're in human free choices or elsewhere. And so I'm attracted to that view. And worth noting is that if you are attracted to that view, as is Van Inwagen, by the way, right, it gives you a way of at least wondering about the first premise, right? Because what the first premise tells us, I mean, there's some subtleties here, but if the first premise is telling us that if God exists, there are no gratuitous evils, and gratuitous evils are evils that God doesn't end up having a good reason. Sorry, let's put it like this: if you think that what a gratuitous evil is an evil that has no morally sufficient justification for its being allowed, right? And you think with me that open theism is at all plausible, then you might think, well, look, there could be cases in which there are evils that occur, and as a matter of fact, there is no good reason for that one being allowed, but there was a good reason for allowing the thing without a good reason to occur. So that's a subtle point, but let me see if I can make sense of it, right? So just consider a totally toy case that is, whenever we're talking about the problem of evil, the chance that we're being insensitive is high, and we have to be careful about this. So I'm making a toy case that I hope isn't insensitive to concrete suffering. Okay, but so here's the case: imagine that God has to decide which of two people are going to have to bear some really horrible thing. Just allow, for the sake of argument, that God can't make it that no one bears it. The universe has not worked out that way. Free choices have not worked out that way. It's one of these two people is going to have to bear it. And God has good reason to believe. Good, but not necessary, because we're accepting open theism here. So God can't be sure, but good reason to believe that this person, upon having the evil befall them, will be able to convert it into a kind of transformative good with God's help for her well-being, and it won't be fundamentally destructive of her life. Whereas this other person, God thinks, has got good reason for thinking it would be overly burdensome to them, and so God freely chooses to let it befall this person. And it turns out the person does not rise to the occasion. They in fact are crushed by it. They're not able to join God in converting it into something that's transformative for them. And it becomes, in that sense, a gratuitous evil. And I'm inclined to think that kind of thing could be possible. And so then I think in cases like that, it will turn out that God exists and is perfectly good, and yet there are some evils that are gratuitous because they, as it were, slipped through the cracks, right? And so I think that's a coherent view. It does presuppose the open theist position, and so some people will resist it on those grounds. But on the assumption of open theism, it strikes me as at least minimally plausible that one could be false.
Yes, and I'll go ahead and I think now's a good time to plug this. So I did an interview with Dr. Class Cray
Nice.
on um, just premise one. The whole interview
Oh, the whole interview was on premise one.
Is just on premise one, and specifically showing that gratuitous evil is compossible with the existence of God. And I could be mistaken about this, but I don't know that the argument that he gave by Hasker presupposes open theism. I know Hasker is an open theist, but I'd have to check. But it seems like there's a different kind of reason that Hasker has for rejecting that premise than just saying it's kind of the result of open theism. And then Class Gray summarizes Peter Van Inwagen's argument for the compossibility of those two. So if you're really interested in digging into the details, go check out that interview. Okay, now you and I both, I think, agree on this. So I'm not an open theist.
Okay.
But I'm open to open theism, but I'm not an open theist. So you and I think, agree on this. You take the skeptical theist response to be the most promising response.
I don't know, Joy. I think that the skeptical theist response is a fairly compelling contribution to the whole story. I think if I'm pressed, I actually am inclined towards a kind of cumulative strategy that involves some various of the elements fitting together. Sure. But I do want the skeptical theist position to be sort of minimally forceful. So the objections to it are relevant for me.
Okay. Yeah. Well, setting aside then, I was just trying to find some good common ground there. But setting that aside then, what are the major objections to skeptical theism? Yeah. And you just have to like briefly sketch this. I did an entire interview.
Oh, good.
Where 4 reasons were given for skeptical theism and 4 reasons were against it. I did that with Justin McBrayer. But if you just want to briefly sketch some objections here and how you respond.
Good. Maybe the central objection then worth just getting on the table, that it iterates in various different ways, but is a kind of, sometimes I think of it as too much skepticism objection, right? But where the basic idea is this, that what some folks have claimed is that in various different places, if you accept the skeptical theist's claim, that is, if you accept that you shouldn't accept Rowe's inference from our inability to reason, from our incapacity to find reasons for E1 and E2 to there probably are no good reasons. If you accept that as a bad no-seem inference, you're forced to accept a bunch of other skeptical conclusions that are supposed to be pretty ugly, right? Like, for example, some have claimed if you accept that skeptical inference, or if you reject that skeptical inference, then you'll have to reject lots of the premises in ordinary arguments for God's existence that look like maybe they turn on similar no-seem inferences. Or maybe the most forceful are moral things, where they claim, look, if you accept the skeptical theist skepticism, you're going to have to accept that you don't have good reasons for like saving a drowning child in a pond, right? If the child's drowning in a pond and you think, well, I ought to save the drowning child, and they'll say, but look, your inference is that from the fact that you can't see any good reason for letting the child drown to there probably is no good reason to letting the child drown, but that's a bad inference in that case. God might have reasons for letting the child drown. And then the claim is supposed to be this: those consequences of accepting the skeptical claim are really untoward. They're going to undermine your religious commitments. They're going to undermine your arguments for God's existence. They're going to undermine various forms of moral action. And so what you should do is you should do the reductio on those, right? If it leads to those bad conclusions, you ought to think something's gone wrong and you should give up your skeptical theism. In general, I do think that there's something to these, and in each time there's a new iteration. And by the way, they keep iterating. Like, you'll get a new one each week of somebody saying, "Well, here's the way in which accepting skeptical theism leads to this really bad skeptical conclusion elsewhere." But so far, whenever I encounter them, I find myself thinking, "Look, the skeptical claim is just a kind of epistemic humility about our relations to God." And of course, vis-a-vis God and what God's reasons might be for doing things. But that doesn't eliminate me having a lot of good reasons to do things independently of that. And God can give people reasons, so God could reveal things to folks. So in general, I find these a little unpersuasive. Again, I want to stay open to the next one that comes down the pike. But for now, I tend to think, each time I hear them, I find myself thinking, but I'm just trying to stay intellectually humble with reference to what I could understand about what God's like and what God's reasons could be. And is my being intellectually humble about that affecting my ability here to save the drowning child or to reason about the cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument? And most of those cases, when I look at them, I think, no, it's not infecting that. It's staying in place. But I understand the complaint. So I'd say that's the deepest one that comes immediately to mind.
Yeah. I will say you spent in the book at least 2, maybe 3 pages on your response to this too much skepticism worry.
Yeah.
And I thought you did a really nice job
Okay.
on those 2 to 3 pages. It's
Good.
difficult to unpack that here because you talk about this premise called goods. And
Yeah.
so I don't want to take too much time here to unpack that, but it's definitely worth checking out in the book. Maybe we can make like a short video on that at some point in the future. That would be cool.
That'd
But
be great. I'd love it.
okay. So let's try and summarize then. Before you tell us where it leaves us, I'll give my best shot at a summary here.
Yeah.
And then you can tell us where we're going to from here. So we started out looking at 2 cases of evil, and they seemed gratuitous. They struck us as the kind of thing that God just wouldn't have a good reason for. We would be struggling to try to find a good reason for those. So Rowe has this argument that you've got on the board. This is the evidential argument. It's evidential because it's not trying to show that evil and the existence of evil and the existence of God are logically incompatible. It's just trying to say that the existence of evil is good evidence that God doesn't exist. It could be the case that God does exist and you get this kind of evil, but nonetheless, it provides good evidence. So that's the distinction between the evidential and the logical. And what you did was you laid out 3 responses to the evidential argument from evil. One was this kind of skeptical theist response, which says we should withhold judgment about premise 2. The Morean response says, no, actually, we should reject premise 2. And instead, we have our own more plausible argument for the rejection of 2. And then the third response was to reject premise 1, and you sketched a reason following from open theism. It's based on open theism. So those were the 3 responses. And we looked at, with respect to the skeptical theist response, well, but does that response have this problem of there's too much skepticism? And we don't have time to fully unpack it here. You hinted at, no, I think it seems like there's the right amount of skepticism about this. So check out my interview with Justin McBrayer if you want more on that. And I also have an entire interview on just that too much skepticism worry alone coming out soon with Dr. John DePoe. So check that out.
Love it.
Okay. What would you like to say then to conclude and kind of show us where we're going next?
Well, one thing to say is it does my heart good to know that there are the other folks filling in the gaps, right? I'm glad to know that you've got those other interviews. Justin McBrayer is fantastic. I love the fact that you've got other experts around who are filling, quite detailed. I'm feeling like what I'm doing is kind of quite wide scope. and maybe I should put it this way, with respect to the evidential argument. I still think the evidential argument has considerable teeth, right? So it can sound like I was being get bit cavalier here. I don't think this argument's easy to get around. I don't think that people like William Rowe, who found this argument compelling, were making an obvious mistake. I don't think that I don't I do think that my own theism is rational in the face of it, given some of my responses to it. But I don't think it's easy. I think it can be a close call. And furthermore, I should add that, like, we're only looking at Rowe's evidential argument, but there have been other versions, and especially Paul Draper's, which takes a slightly different strategy and tries to avoid, I'm not sure if it does, but he tries to avoid worries about skeptical theism in framing it in this distinctively neo-Humean way that I think is really powerful. So what I don't want to go away leaving the impression, Jordan, is that hey, there's the evidential argument, poof, it's gone. Far from it. If anything, I hope those of you folks who are watching will think that's a really serious argument that needs more attention, and that, hopefully more people will be attending to it. And then, you want me to say where I think it's going? I'm not sure. Maybe you should say where you think it's going.
So you mentioned at the end of the chapter that there's this additional gratuitous evil that really is hard to make sense of why God would allow such a thing. And that's this evil of there being non-resistant non-belief. There are these people who really want to have a relationship with God, really want to know God. That seems like the highest good that you could have, is to have a relationship with God. Why would surely that's the highest? And so what could override God fulfilling that person's desire of knowing him? And that's leading into this problem of divine hiddenness. Isn't divine hiddenness this very difficult type of gratuitous evil? Am I capturing the idea correctly?
You absolutely are. And I think part of the reason why I find that particular version of the problem particularly compelling is just for the same reasons that I've been noting about folks like William Rowe and Paul Draper. These are not unwilling, resistant non-believers. These are people who did or would like very much to believe that God exists and find themselves incapable of doing so. And if you mix in concrete suffering in people's lives and why they aren't getting a word from God in the midst of that, it's a really hard problem.
So the part 3 of this 4-part series, the next interview, is going to be all about the problem of divine hiddenness. So you'll definitely want to check that out. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming on, and I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jordan.
All right, we'll see you soon.